It's my great pleasure to introduce Don Wilding. Welcome back, Don. Let's go.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming here tonight. Can you hear me okay? All right, excellent. I'm glad about that. We are here tonight to talk about my fifth book, Historic Storms of Cape Cod. Some of you may remember some of these storms very well. Some of you may not have very fond memories of these storms. I've heard a lot of people say their memories of these storms were not particularly pleasant ones. But there's a lot of stories behind it. So getting to all these different storms, I'll try to cover as many of them, but I'll be looking particularly about 7 or 8 of them. And then there's other storms too from the 20th century and 21st century that I'll also, if we have time, I'll get into a little bit more. With storms here on Cape Cod, it's almost like a sporting event when a storm comes around. People tend to be spellbound when a storm hits. They run to the beach first thing. And as my friend Nan Turner Waldron wrote in her book, Journey to Outermost House, she said, every one of us needs to feel beyond self, to feel small against distant horizons, to feel powerless against the winds, to feel voiceless against the thunder of the storm. So Cape Cod has a lot of special features which affect the damage storms can do here. The sustained high winds can push seawater far above high tide levels, especially in enclosed bays. Buzzards Bay collects high water and hurricane winds from the south, as you'll see very shortly. Cape Cod Bay fills up in nor'easters. The shallows east and south of the Cape get very choppy in storms, just as the North Sea does. So it's really plenty of peril at sea during a storm. These were the observations of Russell Lavelle, the historian for the town of Sandwich, back in 1973. I'm going to cover hurricanes here tonight. And the name hurricane, it actually comes from the Mayan god Huracan, who, according to this account from the Chatham Historical Society, Huracan sent his thunderbolts and ferocious windstorms upon the people and blew the seas into raging fury that swept all creatures before him into death and destruction. Cape mariners would later come face to face with Huracan's towering anger and developed a very healthy respect for it. So what kind of hurricanes do we get? Well, there's 2 kinds generally. There are the Cape Verde systems. These are the ones that develop off the coast of Africa, near the Cape Verde Islands, and just come right across the Atlantic. And they tend to be really giant storms. According to Glenn Field from the National Weather Service office in Norton for the Boston area, Glenn told me last year, I had the opportunity to spend about 3 hours with him there one day, and I could have stayed all day. Very interesting stuff that he was telling me. But he says with these Cape Verde storms, they're the big ones, the ones that cover really massive areas. They take over a week to get across the Atlantic, and the Bahama area storms, the ones from the Caribbean, they tend to be a little smaller. They accelerate up the coast, but they give very little lead time. Now here's something to remember. When all the hype is going on about a hurricane, and that they're watching, is it going to hit New England? Well, here's something you should remember. A rule of thumb. A storm has to be 72 degrees west longitude to have a chance of hitting us here in New England. So I remembered this last September. I talked to Glenn in June. September, we were being threatened by Hurricane Lee. Let's see, maybe some of you remember that. It turned out to be a bust in the eyes of a lot of people. But as it was approaching New England, a lot of people thought, oh, this is going to hit us. Well, it turned out Hurricane Lee never got closer than, it got to about 68 degrees west. And I said, well, this will test it. And sure enough, this Cape Cod, Hurricane Lee went kind of like that, out past us, sailed to our east. So we didn't really get hit by it. It was not a direct hit. The point when New England needs to take action is when there's a named storm in the Bahamas. If it's off the North Carolina coast, you're late. You're already having impacts from the storm. And then there's our old friend, the nor'easters. And Cape Cod is usually right in the path of these very powerful low pressure areas. They develop in the latitudes between Georgia and New Jersey, within 100 miles east or west of the East Coast. They progress generally northeastward, typically attain maximum intensity near New England and the maritime provinces of Canada. As we saw, especially with the blizzard of '78, they can take a very long time to get through the area. So with nor'easters, Henry Beston made a great observation about them in the outermost house, and he witnessed plenty of them. And he said, with the turn of the tide came fury unbelievable, describing a storm back in 1927. The great rhythm of its waters now at one with the rhythm of the wind. The ocean rose out of the night to attack the ancient rivalry of earth, hurling breaker after thundering breaker against the long bulwark of sands. So speaking of intense nor'easters, I wrote this book last year. It's called Cape Cod and the Portland Gale of 1898. The Portland Gale wasn't called the Portland Gale because of what it did to Portland, Maine so much. It's because of what it did to the steamship Portland. Nearly 200 people died aboard the steamer Portland when it left Boston on the night of November 26, 1898. It's been referred to as the Titanic of New England. The Boston Sunday Post, a week after the storm, referred to it, it was a night to try men's souls. It was a night when the strongest of men trembled and when women wept. It was a night that should witness deeds of human bravery. It was a night of agony and of death. It was a night when the Coast Guardsman was remembered. This was the steamer Portland, named for the city of Portland. It was one of two steamships that ran regularly between Boston and Portland, Maine. It was one of the primary methods of transportation in those days, too. If you wanted to get between these two cities, you would either take the steamer or you would take the railroad, one or the other. So the Portland was due to leave Boston Harbor the night of November 26th. It was never heard from again. The remains of it now lie over the Stellwagen Bank area of Massachusetts Bay in 460 feet of water. During that storm, which was a very tremendous nor'easter, it was very similar in style and the way it formed and intensity to the blizzard of '78, to give you an idea. But this was 1898, so a lot of people weren't ready for it. They knew a bad storm was coming. They didn't know how intense. This was another classic case of what you would call bombogenesis. They love using that word for weather forecasts. But in this case, this storm was a couple of systems that came together, and when it did, it hit everybody really hard. 141 vessels were wrecked off the coast of New England. 40 of those were from Cape Cod. Over 450 lives lost during this storm at sea. Oops, here we go, hold on, there we are. This was the map of, I can't do the pointer here, so I'll just walk over here and tell you. Left Boston at about 7 o'clock that night. The course up to Portland took it, past the North Shore. When they left at 7 p.m., the snow began at 7:37. And by 9 o'clock, it was an intense hurricane going on, a winter hurricane. And this is when it was believed to have started to drift out to sea. Nobody knows what really happened to the Portland, what caused it to go under. But it eventually drifted out to sea. Originally, they thought it ran aground off of the Highland Light area or Peaked Hill bars of Provincetown. No, it ended up going down over Stellwagen instead, which they found out much, much later. Excuse me. The keeper at Highland Light in Truro recorded a wind gust of 90 miles an hour during the height of the storm. Keeper Joshua James out of the station in Hull estimated that the visibility was about 100 yards at best. So imagine you're out at sea during a storm and you can't see more than 100 yards. That's trouble. That's big trouble. So that's why there were so many wrecks during that storm. And within 2 hours, you had 200 vessels from Maine to Martha's Vineyard that were scrambling for some kind of safe harbor from the storm. And on the beaches, there were plenty of shipwrecks, and the surfmen of the life-saving service were kept very busy for the next couple of weeks. They worked like fiends, is one of the descriptions that was given. The sand cut their faces until they were raw and bleeding. So imagine how you're walking the beach during the summer and it's windy out. Maybe it was like that today. And the sand just whacks you in the leg and you're like, wow, that's annoying. Now imagine that blasting you in the face at 90 miles an hour. That's what these guys were going through. It also ripped some lightships from their anchors. There were a lot of these lightships, floating lighthouses that were off the coast of Cape Cod back at that time. One of them was called the Pollock Rip lightship. It was just anchored off the coast of Chatham. In this particular case, broke loose from its moorings and it drifted all the way down to Delaware, off the coast of Delaware, before they could finally bring it back a couple of weeks later. And the harbors of Provincetown and Vineyard Haven on Martha's Vineyard were also battered. There were schooners all over them. There were 36, I think, that were damaged or destroyed up in Provincetown, and Vineyard Haven it was more like 50. And they were tossed around like toys. The top photo here you see is of Provincetown Harbor, some of the damage that was done. All but, I think, 1 or 2 wharfs were damaged beyond repair following that storm. In Martha's Vineyard, there was a case of several of these ships were being just thrown around during the course of the storm, and a couple of these happened to be lime schooners from Maine. They were carrying mineral lime. Now, something I did not know before I started researching that book was that with lime, if it gets wet, it ignites. So these ships caught fire. And one of them was on fire and the crew was faced with the choice of either drowning or burning. Well, fortunately enough, they were thrown around close enough to another ship that they jumped off and got onto this other ship. And so they escaped with their lives there. The other one smoldered until the middle of December. That's how long it was before the fire went out. There were also damage to the railroad tracks at Sandwich, West Barnstable, and North Truro. These were all washed out, derailed train travel for several days here on the Cape. Trees were down Cape-wide. This is in Sandwich up top on the left here. The railroad track and wires are just thrown around. There was a 4-foot storm surge there. And this is downtown Sandwich that you see there. Some of those really great big trees that they had there for so many years. And the Daniel Webster Inn, too, was another victim that lost its roof. Its roof was damaged during that storm. I'll jump ahead now to maybe you have some older relatives in your family who remember this. The 1938 hurricane, also known as the Long Island Express or the Great New England Hurricane. The thing about this hurricane, it was a Category 3 when it hit New England. Killed over 600 people in New England. I think it was close to 20 people here on the Cape, mostly in the Upper Cape area. It moved northward at a forward speed of 60 miles an hour. That's unheard of. It just came out of nowhere. They didn't know this storm was happening. That they had no idea that it was coming. They expected rain and some wind. That's all. And people were out at the beach and everything, and then this thing hits in September, and people just didn't know what to do. When it made landfall, it was still moving at 51 miles an hour. It didn't lose hurricane status until it got up into Vermont, which is very unusual. Usually, once it hits the coast, that's it. This one kept its hurricane strength until it got into Vermont. It had recorded sustained winds of 121 miles an hour, wind gusts up to 186 up at Blue Hill Observatory outside Boston. Storm surges, 18 to 25 feet in Buzzards Bay. Now that's one for the books. It was also something like that during the Great Colonial Hurricane of 1635. Was believed to have a storm surge, something like that as well. This is one, if it hit today, the damage would be astronomical, way worse than what happened in 1938. There was 20 feet of water in downtown Providence during that storm. There was 8 feet of water in some of the streets of Falmouth. And after it hit, this was the reaction the next day from a Wareham newspaper editor. He wrote, "Then came the dawn." He said, "Words cannot describe it. To the writer whose own newspaper plant had been under 6 feet of water, the thought came to him, as it must have to all who sustained like losses, that the blow was too great to realize. Where to begin, what to do, nobody knew, but everybody began to do something, futile as it might seem." So there were a couple of quick stories I can relay to you, and I went into detail more in the book about it. In Falmouth, there was a woman who drowned after her car ran out of gas on Beach Road near the Moore Pavilion in Falmouth. She and her nephew were out that day running some errands, doing some shopping. On the way back, the nephew said, "Hey, our gas gauge is getting a little low. You think we should get some gas?" "No, we'll be okay." On their way back, they go near the water, near this Moore Pavilion, and they run out of gas as the storm is just coming in. And again, they had no idea what was happening. So she decides to stay there at the car and wait it out, watch the waves while he goes to get gas. Well, he came back, she wasn't there. Somebody had seen her trying to get out of the car through the rapidly diminishing visibility. And next day they found her body after the storm, because it hit so quickly. There were people who tried to rescue her, they couldn't. There was also 5 residents of a cottage in the Grey Gables area of Bourne lost their lives when the structure was dropped into Buzzards Bay, swept into the Cape Cod Canal, finally came to rest against the north side of the Bourne Bridge. You can see it right there. And the victims were removed from a hole in the cottage's roof. And the picture here on the left is the Buzzards Bay train station underwater. You can see that car is almost completely submerged there, and the railroad bridge in the background, and the other picture there is from Falmouth. And one of the oceanographers at the Oceanographic Institution said, "I'm convinced that the water here rose because it was caught in a bottleneck, because this storm surge was driven right into Buzzards Bay," and that's what happens. It has no place to go. The tide was rising just as the wind was rising. So the storm and high tide hit at the same time. So that's a key for disaster. A few years later, only 6 years later, another one hit. September 14th, 1944. This one was known as the Great Atlantic Hurricane of 1944. Another Category 3, but this one arrived 3 hours after high tide. Falmouth made out a little bit better during this storm. It was the mid and lower Cape area that sustained more damage during this storm. And also at sea, the Vineyard Lightship was at its usual station near Cuttyhunk Island at the mouth of Vineyard Sound. It went to the bottom during this raging hurricane. 12 men died during that storm. They were told to stay at their post by their commanders. And it was during the early morning hours of September 15th, the region's being battered by 105-mile-an-hour winds, storm surge of 8 to 10 feet. Flares were spotted at sea in the vicinity of the lightship's location. Well, that didn't last long. It disappeared during the night, and that's when it went under. The bell to that lightship is now on display at the New Bedford waterfront. West Dennis was hit particularly hard. Lower County Road was under 8 feet of water during that storm. The Lighthouse Inn suffered its worst damage ever. They had just built a new dining room in June of 1944 off to the side, and it wasn't there long. It was destroyed. It ended up being swept away into If you've ever gone to West Dennis Beach, you see where the Lighthouse Inn is, swept right across that beach into Weir Creek, in the back of the beach there. And 27 cottages to the east of the inn were also destroyed. The Lighthouse Inn has taken its lumps over the years, and they've managed to actually do a very good job repairing everything and building taking new measures to secure the building from this kind of damage. Chatham also, boats were swept from the Stage Harbor shore, piled up on Turns Island. A building there collapsed with a couple of wharfs, and where the State Harbor fishing fleets tied up, those were swept away. Winds blew the steeple off the Chatham Universalist Church, and the Morris Island Bridge, which you see on the right-hand side, was washed out. They also ended up enlisting the help of some of the German POWs that were at Camp Edwards at that time, since this was during World War II. And they helped with the cleanup of some of the downed trees. 4 sawmills ended up being brought in by the Army just to turn the trees into lumber after all that. So they were more prepared for the 1944 hurricane. They ended up being there was much less in the way of fatalities all around New England and on the Cape. But 10 years later, 70 years ago, not one, but 2 hurricanes hit. Hurricane Carol on August 31st, 1954, followed on September 12th by Hurricane Edna, both monster-sized hurricanes. Carol was kind of like a twin to the 1938 hurricane. This is a scene from Hurricane Carol in Falmouth. One of the Coast Guard ships is just being thrown around after it lost its anchor. The storm surge coincided with high tide, much like 38, moved northward with a forward speed of 40 miles an hour, storm surge of 14 feet, sustained winds 80 to 100 miles an hour, high tide was 10 and a half and just over 11 feet above mean high water on the Falmouth shore of Buzzards Bay. There was one story there from Carol that I thought was pretty interesting. A gentleman named John McLaughlin, he got a call from his neighbor, Martha Winnick, asked if his daughter Jean was available to babysit. And he had been watching what was going on out in Vineyard Sound with the waves and everything. He knew a storm was coming, a bad one. And she told him, oh, this is an important engagement. Well, he was a little more concerned about these waves, and he says to her, get out of the house. But it was too late. This lady, along with her sister and 3 girls, all perished when the surge from Carol went over the road and carried the house like a cork into Great Pond, smashed it into pieces. And there was a rescue effort by 6 men with ropes and everything to try to tie it around their waist just to reach their house. It failed. And the children that perished were 7, 5, and 2. Then there was a story out here that I was told. Lydia Moore, who at the time was 13 years old, and along with her aunt, 2 cousins, and 2 friends, went for a camping trip, a long-planned camping trip out to Sampson Island in Pleasant Bay. They ended up riding out the storm before being rescued by the Coast Guard. It ended up being quite a time for them, too. They had a ball, but they ended up having to get rescued by the Coast Guard. And Lydia's father was the one that ended up sending the Coast Guard to come and get them. There was another lightship, too, during this storm that was almost a victim. That was the Nantucket lightship. Endured 2 hours of hell during that hurricane. Well, they made it somehow, but this 959-ton floating lighthouse, bow plate smashed, rudder gone, bridge almost demolished, groped into port under tow. It was a 12-man crew. They couldn't have abandoned ship if they wanted to, but somehow they survived it. They really thought they weren't going to be around to talk about it. And then came Hurricane Edna, just 12 days later. This was a Category 2. And when it hit, it actually had 2 storm surges. that hit the Cape, one on the south shore and south side of the Cape, and as it passed directly over the Cape, around the Mashpee area. And as it passed over through Cape Cod Bay and then up towards Stellwagen Bank, its cyclonic motion brought in wind from the northwest, and you had another storm surge that went into Wellfleet Harbor, about 10 feet in Wellfleet Harbor. And as Glenn Field told me, he said, it's not one size fits all around here, even when it comes to hurricanes. Now we come to the storm where many of you probably remember this. How many people were here on the Cape for this storm? Okay, we got one or two back here. How many were in the Boston area or somewhere else in New England? Okay, you remember a lot of that. Okay, here on the Cape, it wasn't so much a snow event. I mean, some parts of the Upper Cape, I think, had about a foot. When you got out here, there was a lot of snow the first night. Turned to rain very quickly, but the wind and the tides, this was a new moon tide during this storm. It ended up changing the face of Coast Guard Beach forever. That's the reason you ride that tram down to Coast Guard Beach. Thank this storm for it, because that's what happened. The forecast for this storm was pretty routine. It was going to probably be an above average intensity, but 25 to 40 mile an hour winds, 8 to 16 inches of snow. This was the general forecast for New England. Ended up being a lot worse than that. This was a high tide at new moon on Monday, February 6, 1978. The water in the ocean was 4 feet above normal, for starters. Then you had high winds of 92 miles an hour officially, 120 miles an hour were unofficially clocked. Coast Guard Beach, just down the road, the bathhouse there and the parking lot were completely destroyed, and a 50-foot long concrete septic tank was unearthed near the bathhouse. This was the view from the Coast Guard station. The morning of February 7th, when you look down to the south, this was the Barrier Beach, Coast Guard Beach, totally overrun by this monster storm surge. Up from above, this is the old Conrad Nobly house, called the Butterfly House. And this was taken from the air by Dick Kelsey, who was a pilot. And he actually went out during the eye of the storm. There was actually an eye that formed during this storm, much like it also happened during the Portland Gale that passed over Cape Cod as well. This was the Butterfly House after the storm, just totally thrown on its side. And of course, another victim, Henry Beston's outermost house, which you see some of the relics from it back here. But Beston's house, which was built in 1925 originally, was on the beach for 53 years, best known for being the base of where Henry Beston wrote that book of the same name. And that was destroyed as well. This is a before and after shot. The top one is before the storm. They're in a dune and everything. Down below, it's just nothing but a flat sandbar. Just a few posts left sticking out. That's how much that beach changed just during that storm. This is what was left of pieces of the forecastle that washed up on the shoreline here from this. And this picture is Conrad Nobly on the right and Henry Lind on the left. Eastham's longtime natural resources officer. This was the bathhouse getting pummeled, smashed during that storm. And Robert Finch, the Cape Cod nature essayist, he and I talked about 10 years ago about this, and he had a great description of it. He was there during the storm, as was John Hay, was another Cape Cod writer who was there when that storm hit. But Finch said that there were hundreds of people there watching the waves smash up against the bathhouse. And with every wave, crowds would just cheer. And I said, why is that? What are we cheering about? He said, but that stuck in my mind. And just seeing that kind of thing. And thousands of cars coming down there after the storm, too, just to watch all this damage that was going on. But during the storm, the night the storm hit, everybody wasn't quite sure what was going to happen here, but you had a car full of young people. They were probably late high school age, who got into a Volkswagen. One of the kids was driving it. They went down onto the beach. Now, there used to be a parking lot in front of the Coast Guard station, along with a bathhouse and also a little amphitheater type setup, kind of like they have across the street here. And as they're driving through the parking lot, it's dark. The waves are starting to come in. And they're driving through the parking lot, and they didn't know the waves were coming up behind them. And as they're going along, all of a sudden a wave comes under the Volkswagen, lifts it up, starts throwing it around in the water. These kids are scared to death. Next thing they know, they're in the marsh with the water just carrying this Volkswagen, throwing it all over the place. And they're thinking, oh my God, we're going to die. And they look up over towards the Coast Guard station, and somebody had their lights on in the parking lot. That saved them. They figured, okay, we can get out and climb up, get up that hill, and we'll be safe. And they did. They finally managed to do that. So eventually, after the storm came through, the Volkswagen was towed from the parking lot, brought to a gas station in Orleans, and they changed all the fluids. It was pretty intact otherwise. Changed all the fluids, stuck the key in the ignition, started. Bob C., who was a well-known radio newsman from this area, has lived in Eastham for many years, was here covering it for a local radio station in Orleans. And Bob told me, he said, Volkswagen should have been there to make a commercial. It would have been perfect. This was the scene in back of the Lobster Pot restaurant up in Provincetown. Just debris everywhere. Commercial Street was underwater during this storm, as it was during the Portland Gale, as it was during many of the recent storms, just within the last 10 years. So it seems to be happening with a little bit more frequency. This is one of those dune shacks out in the dunes where the owners, the Champlin family, came from Michigan to check on their beloved shack. And this was one of the other shacks there. They had to have it moved because everything had been wiped out. I have a lot of the details of it in the book. But this is one of the dune shack neighbors, their dog just looking down into the surf over what used to have a whole dune in front of it. And then Monomoy Island was split into 3 pieces during this storm. Huge waves broke through the 30-foot dunes at Ballston Beach. First storm to flood Pamet River. So that's a pretty regular occurrence now too. So we'll jump ahead now to January 2nd, 1987. And I think a lot of people remember this just because of what it did to Chatham Bar. Punched through, changed that area forever too. Now this was about 68 miles an hour for wind gusts in Chatham. There was a lot of snow inland, not so much here on the Cape, but a lot of wind and erosion damage. And meteorologists said that part of the reason for the high waters during this storm was something called syzygy. That's spelled S-Y-Z-Y-G-Y, syzygy. And that term describes a celestial lineup of Earth, Moon, and Sun when the Moon aligns directly opposite the Earth and Sun, or between the 2 bodies. The alignment bulges the tides in some areas of the Earth. So that's what happened here. That's why you had this crazy arrangement. And what happened during that storm with Chatham Bar, it cut a 200-yard swath through North Beach directly across from the Coast Guard station there. So 200 feet wide, 200 yards wide. And this observation was made by Dr. Graham Geis from the Center of Coastal Studies up in Provincetown. He said, shortly after the storm, he said, "We already know the inlet has grown. On January 16th, 1 hour after high tide, this is 2 weeks after the storm, The inlet measured 405 feet across. On February 3rd, at an hour and a half before high tide, it measured 1,620 feet. So that just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Erosion occurred along the northern tip of the newly created South Beach, while the southern tip of North Beach extended somewhat further south. This is a before and after of what Chatham Bar looked like. Before the storm, solid. Opening way down there. And then you can see the big opening right there forming North Beach and South Beach. Now since then there's been quite a few. It's almost a regular occurrence now, with some kind of new break, maybe another one fills in. But it's been absolutely crazy. Dr. Graham Geis described this to me. I got him on the phone last year to describe this. And he described the entire cyclical pattern of the change in the barrier beach off Chatham, and as it related to that 1987 storm. Had a great storm to work with, and I won't go into the details, it's all in the book. But it was something that had been brewing. The patterns of the beach, it was over about 150 years that it took for this to happen. So it was nature at work over the course of 150 years, and then you get this storm that kind of just changed everything. And then, of course, now, 1991, we had two big storms that year. And the last hurricane to hit this area, to hit New England, Hurricane Bob, August 19th, 1991. This one had, Hurricane Bob had peak wind gusts to 125 miles an hour in both Brewster and North Truro. Other gusts of 100 miles an hour in Chatham, 85 in Provincetown. Storm surges of 12 to 15 feet along Buzzards Bay. This was a Category 2. This was up in Provincetown, just over the line from Truro on 6A, the Sandcastle Resort. I stopped by there last year just to get, because I read this in some of my research about how the roof was damaged. I was very familiar with this area because I had stayed in a house that my in-laws used to own right nearby for several years. So I was familiar with the Sandcastle, so I knew where it was. I checked in with them. Sure enough, they had these pictures of from when the roof got ripped off during Hurricane Bob, and there was a lot of descriptions in the papers too. But the woman who's the general manager there now said that she's the one that dug up the pictures for me, but she also said, I was living in Provincetown on Commercial Street during Hurricane Bob, and I went out there during the storm. It was mostly just a lot of wind. There wasn't a lot of rain out in this part of the Cape. She said, but as I'm walking around and the wind is just howling and there's people out in the street and they're partying, they're having hurricane parties out in the street. And she says, and then I looked up and I saw this roof go by. I went back in. There were a lot of roofs, a lot of places lost their lids during Hurricane Bob, especially up in Provincetown and Truro. There's another story too of a tree being lifted up and spinning around. One that had been there for a couple of 100 years. It's just, there was mention of tornadoes. I don't know if they were ever officially confirmed. People claim to have seen twisters during that storm too. Down in this area, this is in Orleans, you see Nantucket Road there on the bottom, the Oddfellows Hall, I believe it is. A lot of damage there on the side. And this is the windmill in Orleans. Lost a couple of blades during Hurricane Bob. This is back to the Lighthouse Inn now in West Ennis. Some of the flooding that went on there. A lot of water in their lower levels. So that's just a sample of what went on with Hurricane Bob. And then a few months later, we get hit with another storm. Well, unlike something that I don't think we'd ever seen before. It's known as the perfect storm. It was first called the Halloween Gale, also referred to as the no-name storm. But then then the book and the movie happened, and that name has stuck, The Perfect Storm. The National Hurricane Center considered classifying this as a hurricane, this storm. But some of the other parts of NOAA were decided against this to avoid unnecessarily confusing and alarming the public, because it was a very unusual kind of system. It was a combination of several weather factors. The fading Hurricane Grace, coming up from the south, was absorbed by this developing low pressure area that formed along a cold front that was coming in off of the coast of around Newfoundland. So you have all these things coming together over the water. You might have seen that scene in the movie where they're looking at the computers and the screen, and he's marveling at it. Perfect storm. You know, and that's what happened. And it took this really weird path. It developed out here, just off of Nova Scotia, and then cut down here, swept underneath Cape Cod, down almost to off the coast of Virginia, you know, or Maryland and the Carolinas almost, and then cut back up into Nova Scotia again. This was over the course of about 5 days. So it was unbelievable what had happened with it. It was a title that was coined from a conversation between Sebastian Junger, who wrote the book. He was Summers and Truro, and the National Weather Service forecaster Robert Case. They came up with the name. And on Cape Cod, there were wind gusts of 78 miles an hour on Morris Island, 79 in Provincetown. A weather buoy off of Nova Scotia recorded a wave exceeding 100 feet. So that's how they got that scene in the movie where they're going up against that wave and they don't make it. You know, this towering wave. That's where they got the idea for that. Nobody really knows what happened with the Andrea Gale out there. They just know it never came back. East of the Cape, they had wave heights of 39 feet. So these kind of waves are pounding the shoreline for days, and especially down in the Chatham Beach Camp area, North Beach, South Beach area. This couple, Bruce and Donna Edson, had experienced their share of storms staying at this beach camp down there, and they sensed something wasn't quite right during this storm, and they ended up being marooned. They couldn't get off the beach because of what was going on with this storm. Several neighbors and some friends staged what they called a heroic rescue by way of ORVs. They couldn't really get anything else out there at that point. The weather was just so incredibly bad. And the guy who drove the truck said, "The ride off the beach was pedal to the metal. Your foot is stuck right to the floor, transmissions are heating up, the sand is nothing but soup, and you're sinking in. So if you stop, you're going to get stuck. The adrenaline is pumping." So right out here at Nauset Light Beach, lost 10 feet of cliff. Stairs were washed away. Part of a fence on a 40-foot overlook was claimed by the waves. There were 3 structures that were washed away down in this area. One of them was the McCusker Boathouse that was right along Nauset Marsh. This ended up just north of Hemingway Landing. My friend John March and I went walking around Hemingway Landing back in, I think this was 2006 maybe 2005. That's me on the right, John's on the left. We found the roof to the McCusker house, just to the north of the Hemingway Landing parking lot. It was in the woods. I went down there last year looking for it. It's not there anymore. So the elements probably took care of it. But this top of the house was sitting there for years. Also over up in Truro, the Pamet River at Boston Beach saw an 82-foot cut created by high surf, and at the time there was a 1,000-foot boardwalk at Gray's Beach in Yarmouthport destroyed during that storm. And Mildred Champlin told me about this after the perfect storm. Friday, November 1st, 1991, a week after we left the Cape, we returned to check on the damage inflicted by the worst storm we had ever endured. The house had gone through 5 days of that enormous storm, 10 high moon tides. Clambering out of the car, racing to the dune's edge, we were stunned to be looking down rather than out over the 100 feet of grass we had a week ago. The storm had clawed away maybe 75 feet of our frontage. The ocean was lapping almost at our feet. The dune to the east was demolished, yard pockmarked with holes dug by the little downdrift whirlwinds. A waste pipe that had been under the sand was exposed, and it was easier to duck under it than climb over it. So over the years too, those were the storms I highlighted in the book, but also there were some other ones I covered. I called these notables and near misses from the 20th century. There was some of them I touch base on here is the Marconi storm of 1901. This is the one that when Guillermo Marconi first set up shop in Wellfleet, he had constructed a set of towers in 1901, and the people there told him the first nor'easter is going to destroy these things, and it did. Marconi went back to work by 1903. He was back in business and did his transatlantic message to England. There was also the Great Gale of 1917 and the Hurricane of 1924. Not a lot of details available on these storms, but they did their share of damage and even claimed some lives, both on land and at sea. 1950, Hurricane Dog, believe it or not. You know how they name hurricanes now? They use male and female names. From 1953 until 1979, it was strictly female names. Before that, before 1950 actually, there was, they were naming whatever name they could come up with, like the Great Atlantic Hurricane, or the Long Island Express, or whatever they could come up with. They didn't have actual names set up for it. 1950, they used a phonetic alphabet sort of way of naming the storm. So that's how you got D as in dog. That's how you got Hurricane Dog. It passed to the east of Cape Cod, but did a lot of damage here on the Cape. Hurricane Donna was actually almost a direct hit. It went a lot further west, though, than they had predicted. But that, too, did a lot of damage at the Lighthouse Inn in Dennis. There were several nor'easters that hit January 1966. December 1990, that uncovered a very old Native American settlement down at Coast Guard Beach that they had to dig up very quickly. And 1992, that was some of the worst flooding they'd ever seen in this area, tidal flooding from this nor'easter that was mostly rain. But during that storm, there were people shopping at the Stop and Shop down here, and you know that's on a very flood area that floods very easily in that down there. And there was an announcement during that storm. Attention shoppers, it is now high tide in the parking lot. And then, of course, there was Hurricane Edouard in 1996. Anybody remember this one? Yeah, this was fun. Not really. Hurricane Edouard we were under hurricane warning on Labor Day weekend. And here's the Cape. Edouard was forecast to go slam right into the Cape. Well, during the night, didn't do that. See, a little background on that. Saturday, they put out the hurricane forecast. And by Sunday, there was the hurricane warning. We're going to get a hurricane. This is Sunday on Labor Day weekend, okay? I was up in Provincetown. My wife and I were up in Provincetown. I saw that. I said, we got to get out of here. And we did. We were living off Cape at the time. And the next day, I couldn't believe the news reports. as what was happening. Everybody was trying to get off the Cape at once. The backup was from the Sagamore Bridge out here to the Rotary, almost. So that's 40 miles. That was just, you know, and people were sitting there for like 8 hours, I think it was. And then the storm just went out to sea. So a lot of business was lost, but, you know, look at the alternative. What if the people didn't leave and it hit? That's the thing. 21st century. I'll just go into a few of these, but blizzard of 05, we had like 3 feet of snow out here in January of 05. Then, this is one of my favorites to talk about because the Stingjet storm of 05, you're probably saying, well, what is he talking about, the Stingjet storm? Was anybody here in December 9th, 2005? There are still trees laying in the woods around here that went down during that storm. It came out of nowhere. It was a case, this is the weather map actually that shows, you see that tight, how it's all wound up right there around the area of Cape Cod, right about here. And this was a normal nor'easter for the rest of New England. But then when the center of the storm hit Cape Cod Bay, some kind of crazy thing happened where it developed so fast, it developed 4 times as fast as a bombogenesis, if you can believe that. And that's what happened here, where trees were down, the winds were about 100 miles an hour in some places. It was worse probably from Dennis out to about here in Eastham. Trees down everywhere. If you go down the street here, even, and down Nauset Road, and then it becomes on the way to Coast Guard Beach. You look in the woods around Dome Rock, there's a lot of trees down in the woods there, old trees. They went down in this storm. There were a lot of dolphins that were beached all along Cape Cod Bay during that storm. They just got so disoriented by the storm. And you couldn't get out of Orleans during the storm because there were so many trees down. It was like a hurricane. It was one of the worst storms I had ever witnessed. Also a few of these others, Tropical Storm Irene, these storms in 2015 and 2018 with the very high tides, and also the tornadoes, which was one where, you know, you had the one that came ashore, I think it was 2019, it came ashore in Hyannis as a waterspout tornado, touched down 3 different times on its way from Yarmouth all the way to Chatham. And it ripped the roof off a hotel in Yarmouth as well. One of the other ones I'll mention here is in 2018. You might remember this was in March. Very abnormally high tides. For many years, Nauset Light had been with the stairways that used to be there, and they had to start replacing them almost every year. Well, after a while, that got to be kind of rough, so they designed that path that leads down. Well, this was March of 2018. They'd just done that path. No more stairways to worry about. Instead, you had this path that cut down to that low-lying area from the cliff. And I went down there, and it was right before high tide. And the tide came down, and more people were starting to come down there and look at what was going on. Well, I saw this tide get closer and closer and closer, and then one of them came roaring through, came splashing through on that path, almost sucked a few people right out to sea with it. I jumped out of the way, and then I got out of there at that point. It seemed to be too dangerous. But a few people chose not to, and one gentleman who took a really great photograph. It was one of the best photographs I've seen of a storm on Cape Cod, where the wave came busting through on that pathway and people were running from it. And they're like, running for their lives in terror from this wave that's coming at them. And he said there was one guy that got knocked down, totally submerged, and was soaking wet, and he got up out of the water after it kind of got up, and he goes, "Oh God, give me another one!" And he said, this guy's nuts. Anyway, these are just some of the ones I get into here. So anyway, Storm Chronicles here, as I called it. This picture is from after the blizzard of '78. You might recognize this from when you come into Eastham. This is a Collins Cove. This is the little shucking house, I think, is also referred to as the Fish and Fiddle Club from the Collins family. And that became kind of a place where they measured the impact of some of these storms because it flooded, as you can see during this. And also during the blizzard of '78, you couldn't get out of Eastham into Orleans. It actually flooded on Route 6 during high tide. That's how bad things got. And people probably ruined a few car engines, unless you were driving a Volkswagen. But in this particular case, this was the scene at Collins Cove. And Ken Collins, the late Ken Collins, who used to be a selectman here in town many years back, he used to mark the level that the storms would come in there in the way some measure the growth of their children. They would mark it on the walls. Jared Collins showed me this a few years ago. And it was, the '78 storm was marked about shin high. It's way down there. The big storm of '87 is waist high. The marks of '91 mean no ink. They cover the garage. So I think he's met the perfect storm there. Yeah, 10/30/91. So, is the worst yet to come? Maybe. Worst case scenario, said Glenn Field from the Weather Service, is a storm with the potency of the 1938 hurricane moving over New England again. He said it's not a question of if, it's a question of when it will happen. In this case, a northern movement of the storm making landfall near Foxwoods in Connecticut would have a 20-foot surge in Narragansett Bay. If you bring the storm up Narragansett Bay, the water has nowhere to go in Buzzards Bay. So there would be 30 feet at Parkwood Beach in Wareham, along Buzzards Bay. And Hurricane Katrina's maximum storm surge was 25 feet. So think about that. And also the coastal development that we've had since 1938, and if something like that hit now, crazy. Mildred Champlin said after the perfect storm, we viewed the devastation and I said I'd never look forward predicting the future. All we know is that Mother Nature is in charge and we have to be grateful for all the years we've had and enjoy right now. So far we've been lucky. Another perfect storm will come in the future. We know that. And this is that storm I was just telling you about in 2018. But also after Hurricane Bob, Cape Cod, they'd call around and they'd check on people. What happened here, what happened there. They called the Orleans Senior Center. Hey, how did the seniors make out during this storm? And the director there said, the seniors didn't have any problems. They all know what to do. It's young people like us who had to figure things out. We think we live in such a sophisticated world, but nature humbles us. So I'd like to thank you for coming here tonight. Let's ramble on.